Thank you, General, and Admiral Haney, and distinguished guests. It's a privilege and an honor to be here to share with you my thoughts. And I want to thank you for letting a long-haired Navy doc who's run adrift of regs on the here to come and talk to you since having missed serving in the forces. I can tell you, though, that our service continues. And I can also tell you that many patriotic Muslims who not only serve in our armed forces, many of us also serve outside in keeping us safe and trying to correct the ideas that are fueling radical Islam, not only domestically but abroad. And families like mine that came to the U.S. escaping persecution were able to find freedom and find the ability to practice our faith as we choose like nowhere else in the world. Unfortunately, the narrative as we see playing out globally is quite different. And I think as you look on a symposium now focused on deterrence, there are many ways, as you know all better than I do, on how to look at deterrence. There's short-term and long-term. I think what I can share with you and help bring some perspective is long-term deterrence. Ultimately, I think if there's anything we've learned in the last 10 years, if not more, is the fact that we cannot win this war militarily. So ultimately, how do we deter war? The short term, again, is, I think, something, and as I've testified to Congress on Homeland Security, I'm not most Muslims are not going to be the ones to de-radicalize people that have already become radical. But the pathway for societal, personal, cultural radicalization is something that starts and has a long continuum. And I think ultimately the countering of those ideas is best done early on rather than late. And without a long-term deterrence strategy, we end up militarily not only spending billions, but giving the lives of our sons and daughters in short-term deterrence, which ultimately is a sophisticated whack-a-mole program. And this is a nonpartisan, bipartisan comment, and that regardless of who's in the White House or which party's in control of policies, I think both could tell you, and I think we can see, have failed in ultimately changing that whack-a-mole program into some type of clear strategy over the next century. But this narrative, as we see it playing out, it's interesting. If you look at and the book I wrote is called A Battle for the Soul of Islam, and I truly believe that this battle is within our faith. And if you look at the narrative of families like mine, when we came to America, our family realized that we could, in America, a country that was founded by devout Christians, but yet the word Christian doesn't appear in our documents. And that's not an accident. And ultimately, the American experiment, if you will, doesn't just have to be the domain of America. That why can't Muslims go through that same type of experimentation? Why can't Muslims figure out liberty? And I think ultimately we've been fighting this world, the threat of trying to keep us safe against all the things that threaten our security domestically and abroad. We've been fighting this with not only both arms tied behind our back, one arm being that in which we want to advocate liberty, but the other one being how do we counter an enemy that uses the language of a faith, and yet we have all come through now generations of believing that the domain of faith is the personal domain, so therefore we can't get into it. I can't tell you the number of times I've talked to State Department folks, Pentagon folks, and others that say, well, once it starts being about Islam, we just don't get into it. So how ultimately do we fight an enemy whose ideology is not only theologic, but theopolitical? And it was interesting, during the Cold War, we had many that could have been allies that were non-Soviet communists, but we never considered them to be ideologically our allies because we knew that the communists, whether they were in Central America, China, or wherever they were, even though they weren't Soviet, were ultimately still driven by an ideology that was an anathema to Western society and freedom and liberty. But yet when it comes to political Islam, this old paradigm of our enemy's enemy is our friend has really gotten us into this whack-a-mole program. And I would tell you that one of the things I hope you leave here with today is that the old tired paradigm that my family escaped in the Middle East, where somehow we were destined to either be run by autocrats who pretended to be religious, or autocrats who were military generals who used the power of the military to oppress their society, that we're not destined to be sentenced to those two choices. It's not a binary choice. There are third and fourth and other choices. But how can they navigate that, and what can America do? And I hope that today I can show you that the only real security for America lies in the deterrence in navigating, in stimulating this debate within the House of Islam. As long as we keep an arm's length and we don't take sides within the House of Islam, I would argue that our doctrine today is a Darwin doctrine, that ultimately is basically letting the most powerful, the most financially equipped, the most militarily equipped to win these battles that exist. You can call them tribal, you can call them sectarian. Ultimately, whoever's got the money, the weapons, or the influence in the community and the nation is going to end up winning based on a Darwin doctrine. And if the West doesn't defend those who are reformists, who are looking to counter the ideas that are driving the power brokers, I don't see a chance for any type of security for us anywhere in the near future. And I would argue, and as many of us have, in the coalitions that we're building slowly of reformists, and it's a struggle. I can tell you, my family who continues to think that I'm tilting at windmills, my poor wife who deals with not only with the death threats we get from Al-Qaeda abroad, who labels me as any part of conspiracy movement that you can label, but even locally in Phoenix or across the country, organizations that claim to speak for our faith community are used to having a monopoly on the voice of Islam. And this is what's happened. This was the product of the OIC, the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation, which are 56 countries that, left to their own devices, hate one another. But if you go to the website of the OIC, they dump hundreds of millions of dollars into uniting under the concept that the West is their enemy and the West hates Islam, and they've thus put us on the defense. By putting us on the defense, it allows them to also fuel a radicalization of their own peoples that legitimizes military control, that legitimizes oppressive societies. I can tell you that when I testified to Congress on Syria back at the beginning of the revolution, we told them that, listen, if you don't really get to helping the opposition, it will radicalize the Syrian population, and you will lose multiple opportunities that may not seem very pleasant, but are only going to get worse. And sure enough, ISIS today in northern Iraq is simply a symptom of a deeper problem that came out of Syria. So, my day job, as the general mentioned, is as a physician. And, oh, by the way, I'm trying to also reform Islam. But, Bethesda Naval Hospital, when I trained internal medicine there, they taught us the basic things of internal medicine, which was that you don't treat symptoms, you treat the disease. The symptom is not violent extremism. This is the new lingo that Washington and others are using because it's politically correct. And yet we have staring us in the face one of the most barbaric organizations that we can, in recent history, remember, calling itself the Islamic State, and somehow we want to say that, oh, they're just sort of a psychiatric product of some psychopaths. When in fact, as a physician, I would tell you that the diagnosis is not a coincidence that they call themselves the Islamic State, that there may be less violent forms of the Islamic State, but all of that is short-sighted deterrence when you want to deal just with the non-violent Islamic states, because it is an ideology incompatible with true liberty and individual freedoms. There's no way to massage it into something that works. And ultimately, the ones that are more moderate, I would tell you as a Muslim, are actually more dangerous because they aren't what they appear, and they actually prevent debate within the House of Islam and will portray to the West that somehow there are allies, like we see with Saudi Arabia, we see with the Egyptian dictatorships and others, when in fact they may in the short term give us stability, but in the long term, the Muslim Brotherhood, which I see as one of the largest threats to global security, is a byproduct, was fueled by dictators who for long we considered to be our allies. Mubarak and Sadat before him, and Nasser before him. And ultimately, these dictators know that the fueling of radical Islam allows them to then control not only the faith dialogue, but society. And if you look at Assad's bombing patterns in Syria, surprise, surprise, our family's neighborhoods in Aleppo, where the moderate Sunnis are really what are being pummeled and massacred, while ISIS is being left pretty much alone in northeastern Syria. Why is that? There have been a number of articles written about that, and I think you'll see that if you look at that, and many of you probably know better than I, that these dictators know that if you look, Hamas, where does it get its missiles? From Iran. And yet that's Sunni and Shia, and somehow, why are they working together? Well, many of these theocrats and dictators know that if they can fuel radical Islam and allow it at least to leave it controlled, they will legitimize a dictatorship and continue to prevent really the main threats to the survival of regimes like Assad or the royal families of Saudi Arabia and others, which are moderate, free-thinking, more secular-minded Muslims. So ultimately, as a physician, and you want to treat the condition, bombing ISIS in northern Iraq is like getting rid of a metastatic tumor without dealing with the primary tumor. Primary tumor came out of Syria. And I don't think that this can be solved by, again, putting troops on the ground. But ultimately, within Syria, very different than Iraq, was an indigenous movement of a majority of the Syrian population that wanted freedom. No one was to say that there was going to be more stability than there was under Assad. But I think the greatest teaching moment came not in Revolution 1.0 in Egypt, but in Revolution 2.0. Initially, you had an uprising of a majority of the Egyptian population against Mubarak. It's a no-brainer. They had economic problems. They wanted to fight against a military dictator, so they went to the streets, and the Egyptian military proved to be smarter than the Syrian one in that they just offered up the president and ultimately somehow said they were going to have elections. Most reformers would tell you in Egypt, Saad Ibrahim was interviewed in the Wall Street Journal, said, please, no elections for at least 4 years. That's what he said. They had elections within a year, and ultimately you had the Brotherhood elected because they were organized within the mosques and because these dictators just like the royal family in Saudi Arabia lets the Wahhabis control some parts of the religious infrastructure, they are inherently organized. The secularists divided themselves, as we saw in Tunisia. They divided themselves into a number of different parties and weren't able to unify to counter in an election process the theocrats or the Islamists. So they lost. But democracy is not defined by elections. Another point I hope we begin to change in the narrative is that democracy is not about elections. Hamas was elected and it's a terrorist organization. It's because right now, the mindset of the majority of, even though they're starving for freedom and they're going to the streets in a very populist fashion, most of the information that they have in those societies have been fed to them by dictatorships that are fueled by convincing and brainwashing their communities that there's conspiracy theories that drive much of their geopolitics. That needs to be countered. And I can tell you there was nothing more heartbreaking for me than to see a couple things. One is there's been no effort since 9/11, and we were calling for it since the 1979 revolution in Iran, for the U.S. Information Agency to not only exist, which has been shut down, but to start to engage on the ground in these ideas for the liberals in those societies. And now we saw, even when the Pentagon had an Office of Public Diplomacy, which really was an offshoot of the U.S. Information Agency, same thing with State Department's public diplomacy. We see the Commission on Public Diplomacy shut down a few years ago because somehow we threw our hands up and said it's not effective. Karen Hughes was asked to basically lead that effort, and we're not seeing any engagement on the more difficult issues, which are what are the means for advancing a not only counterterrorism, but ideologies that can begin to rebuild these societies after being decimated with dictatorship. And I would tell you that right now what's happened and where we're losing it is that the Islamists have basically equated Western secularism with the secularism of the dictatorships of Mubarak, Assad, Saddam Hussein, and others. And we've not been at the table. We have not been advancing the ideas of liberty, and I think if you want to counter the Islamist movements, the natural counter to them is liberty. And there are three legs to the stool, I think, of long-term deterrence. One is a successful nation state, which we'll talk about, which is how can Egypt and Syria and Iraq build nation states that unify under a unifying ideology. Second is the role of faith in society. And third is the advocacy of liberty and freedom. I think those three legs of that stool, without any one of them, those states will not survive, and we will continue to see failed states for the next century. And I would tell you that the Cold War is nothing compared to the conflict we see in each of these countries without those three legs of that stool. And today, why aren't we having, not only from the White House, but from the Pentagon and from every media outlet and universities, a dialogue about what defines the Egyptian nation state, what defines the Tunisian nation state, these states, the Libyan states, and what are the parties on the ground, what are the ideas that they're pushing forth. We aren't, I mean, even after we went into Iraq, there were hundreds of newspapers that had flourished, and yet we didn't get, I think, enough involvement in giving platforms for the growth of these ideological counters. And my grandfather and my father used to use an analogy that, and this, they passed away, my grandfather passed away in the 80s, and my father, rest his soul, passed away in 2009 before any of the Arab awakening. And if he had only been alive, I would tell him how right he was. He said if the dictatorships ever left, it would be like removing a pressure cooker in mid-cook. What happens if you open a pressure cooker? It just explodes all over the kitchen. And that's what's happening, is these dictators have suffocated their societies for 2-3 generations. And now, as we open them up, we're seeing confusion, chaos, and sort of a struggle for what is the future identity. And what the Islamists have a long head start from not only the Brotherhood in the early 20th century with Hassan al-Banna and the ideas of political Islam, they have a head start on the identity movement, and I call it Islamo-patriotism. The Middle East and all these issues are not as overwhelming as they would seem. And I know it can be overwhelming, but again, as a doctor who likes to simplify diagnoses with my patients, it's pretty straightforward, whether it's the Pakistani Jamaat Islamiyya or Boko Haram in Nigeria or Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or the Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria. All these organizations are basically very, very militant offshoots of a primary gateway drug to this malignancy, which is the identity movement that somehow the faith of Islam is wedded to the political infrastructure of society, to the legal system, and that is fueled not only by the identity for the jihadists, the soldiers who believe that jihad is part of their citizenship, but it also prevents the argumentation necessary for the secularists, the non-Islamist Muslims to argue the law, because you can't have an opinion about these things unless you know Quranic scripture, the hadith, and the Sharia through exegesis. And I think if you look, you don't have to understand Islam to get this. The West went through a same type of process in which canonic law was removed from government and governmental debate became focused on reason. This was the Enlightenment process, and I think that it is very human, as President Bush talked about, that every human being wants at the end of the day to be free to have their individual opinion and to worship God in the way they see fit. And I think ultimately this is that those three legs of that stool are so important for us to understand as we look at long-term deterrence. And the reason it's not that complicated is the OIC is what? It's the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. There's no OCC, right? There's in the West an Organization of Christian Cooperation. And why isn't that? Christian majority countries have not united because we found through the Enlightenment process, not that we don't have very politically motivated religious organizations, that's not what I envision for Muslim populations at all, but the central identity of the nation state has no longer been a religiously based one, but rather one based in freedom and liberty. And I can tell you, we've now begun to form coalitions of Muslims who are looking at countering Islamism. We have an organization called the American Islamic Leadership Coalition that includes a lot of troublemakers like myself who shake the trees and are trying to counter the ideologies of political Islam. And I think we need to move the narrative away from simply being about violent extremism. Because what is that? How do you defeat an ideology that we could basically describe anybody who's gone off the deep end as far as violence? Could be anything from gang violence to everything ends up in violent extremism when it becomes fascistic. But the ideology that unites all of these organizations that's very common is the sense, and I think the debate, as I hope you can understand it in the House of Islam, is a battle between revivalists and reformists. And the reformists are not any less Muslim than the revivalists. The revivalists simply believe, and you can call them Salafists, which are the ones that want to go back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad exactly as they think literally it should be, and the Islamists who basically believe that somehow the state as it existed at the time of the Prophet Muhammad must be replicated in modern times. There are some of the demagogues like Tariq Ramadan and others, I think, who try to put a moderate face on that and say that they utilize democracy, parliaments, etc., to put forth Sharia in a very moderate way. But I would tell you that as long as the oxygen of that legal construct is Islamic law, it prohibits a pluralistic approach, an equality approach of women and men and all faiths or no faith to participate in society. And I can tell you, we've had a number of debates around this country, and I just came back from Oxford, had a debate in London in May about this. And every time you put Muslims against Muslims, and you have a liberty-minded Muslim against an Islamist, I have yet to really see an Islamist win that debate. But the problem is we've not had the platform to do so. Can I fill up auditoriums with Muslims supporting our cause, let alone in America or abroad? No, we can't. We've not been organized. We've not been fueled by the petrodollar industries as the Islamists have. We can't buy, like Al Jazeera, buy a network that's for sale here in the West to spread our message. So unfortunately, a lot of our organizations are very homegrown and operating on very marginal numbers compared to what our enemies are. But I think ultimately, and one of our primary projects that we run is called the Muslim Liberty Project. And this is where we take youth that are young and show them that the American identification with the nation state is ultimately the most important idea to preserve their freedom to be Muslim or not Muslim, to reject the imam or not reject, to disagree or agree with your parents. And this anecdote, if you will, that narrative can be transplanted into every Muslim country. The Egyptians can have the same debate about what does it mean to be Egyptians. Can the Copts in Egypt have the same narrative about being Egyptians that the Sunni Muslims can? And I can tell you that there were 5 to 10 million Egyptians, most of whom were Sunni Muslims, that went to the streets to protest the Brotherhood 1 year after the Brotherhood took over. So 1 year of an opening of society and the Muslim Brotherhood running government did more to destroy the ideas of Islamism and actually bring, I think, long-term deterrence than 60 years of Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak. So this is the issue of the struggle between short and long-term deterrence. And it's just like treating cancer. I have this conversation with my patients all the time. Do you want to get treated with chemotherapy where you're going to get sicker and feel like you're on the edge of death, where long-term you might cure your disease? Or do you want to simply go through palliation and be in comfort care? And I can tell you the reason I'm taking time out of my practice and away from my family and have the support of my family, I look at my kids and I say, well, you know, this really, as much as it's about Islamic Reformation, my personal relationship with God is fine. You know, this isn't about my faith. But global security is in jeopardy. And radical Islam, when you have Islamists who can strap bombs around their waists and go and blow up innocent people in restaurants and public settings, why would that be any different for a government that gets a hold of a nuclear weapon, that has an eschatological understanding of the end of times, that believes that the 12th Imam will come, which is what Ahmadinejad said at the opening of every UN speech he gives? He says it. This is what he believes. So why wouldn't he believe that somehow his nation should undergo some massive suicide bombing? So to me, it is an obligation of I have and my family and Muslims have to treat this cancer. But it can't be done from a whack-a-mole perspective. Yes, the violent extremists need to be treated and dealt with, and I can tell you also that you can't deal with them softly, that from a tribal standpoint, they understand strength, and they will respond to strength. Weakness and appeasement ultimately gives them a green light, and ultimately we saw that with Assad's use of chemical weapons and other aspects. The examples can fill courses. So how do we do this? I think, the question I get is, well, Zudi, boy, this is a tough thing. I'm right behind you. I'll back you up. Go ahead and have at it. Again, I don't think we need to be experts in Islam to navigate this. There are three questions I think we should ask on the ground in every theater that we're in. Are the groups that we want to support, are they against kleptocrats and the autocrats or military dictatorship? Number one. Number two, are they against the Islamists? And, as much as in America the debate has been, oh, you can't use the word Islamism because the political correctness police will get you. In Arabic, they use that term all the time, Islamiyin. Everyone in Egypt knows what the Islamiyin are. They're Islamic movements that are parties that have a platform. They know what they are. So it's not, in the West, we've been, I think, duped into thinking we can't define Islamists. And from a military perspective, I will tell you as an aside, it saddens me. I've had conversations, after we saw Fort Hood and the barbarism that Nidal Hassan did, I've tried to have conversations with, why can't we have security clearances filter for Islamism? And they look at me, oh, no, we can't do that because it's a faith and we would be somehow filtering for Muslims. And if you get it right, if anything, Muslims are your best assets against Islamists. But the bottom line is Islamists, the theopolitical Islamists, are a major threat to our security internally, as Nasser Abdo, Nidal Hassan, and so many have shown, and also externally. So the three questions: are they against Islamist movements in the Middle East? Are they against military dictatorship? And are they for that? The third most important question is, are they for liberty? And they may not understand what that is, and that might be generational, but the bottom line is there's been so many examples. The Green Revolution in Iran, the women's movements that have been smothered in Saudi Arabia, on. And I think ultimately it's going to be hard for us to support those movements when we get portrayed as helping and being allied with their dictators. And I think it's, sort of how the pendulum swung in Egypt is a perfect example. El-Sisi might have brought stability from the chaos that happened after the Brotherhood was running the show. But there's a challenge, there's an opportunity in the Arab awakening that so many of our families had looked for abandoning. And, one of the reasons I served was my grandfather told me that, that the special sauce in America that makes it work is actually the civilian control of the military. The Constitution is certainly a big part of it, but as we know, there are many profound dictatorships that have wonderful constitutions on paper. And ultimately, the civilian control of a military that defers all of its orders to the president that's elected by the people and has separation of powers, that is really what's unique to the West. And that can happen in the Middle East. And you see in Syria what happens when people try to fight against the military dictatorship. And I grew up in a family that taught me that, in America, it's important to serve because in countries like Syria, where the military is run by thugs and some of the most corrupt people on the planet, this is what happens, and we're seeing that come to fruition. So ultimately, there's a quote from Eugene Rosenstock, who said that to a mankind that recognizes the equality of men and women everywhere, every war becomes a civil war. And that was long before the internet that she wrote that. And I think it's interesting that now we can't contain through short-term deterrence every civil war and think that, well, Syria was a civil war. Every Syrian I knew was looking at that thing, civil war. It was being fueled by Russia and Iran with so many surrogates involved that it wasn't a civil war, it was a regional war. And ultimately, a country that greatest asset for actual deterrence of war was its diversity, where you had, yes, 65% of the population Sunni, 10% Kurds, Druze, Alawite, Shia, Christians, so many different populations, and we see this in Iraq also. The diversity is an asset for its stability, but if we allow it to be ripped apart into different nations, every homogeneous country becomes much more unstable. So I would tell you also in long-term deterrence, maintaining, yes, I understand, and many of the Muslims that argue with me say, well, a lot of these nation states are creations from the West anyway that weren't there before World War II. Well, bottom line is that most Syrians I know have a deep nationalistic sense of Syria, and they don't want to see it ripped apart. Same thing for Iraq, Egypt, and other countries. And I can tell you that the identity of the nation state is very important. And if there's one theme I'd like to see us in a long-term deterrence advocate, is helping them build the identity of the nation state. I talked to the mayor of Amsterdam when I was in the Netherlands back in 2006, and he was asking about how to counter, there are many enclaves of Muslim communities around Amsterdam, and I had talked to Muslim students at schools that were funded by the government, Islamic schools, that hadn't talked to a non-Muslim in 3-4 months. And yet, even though they hadn't talked to a non-Muslim and they really didn't understand Western society, they still didn't want to go back to Morocco or Algeria, wherever their families were from. They wanted to stay there. So when I talked to the mayor, he said, what can we do different? And I said, well, you need to reassess. You need to have your country look at what it means to be Dutch and why these kids who can't really articulate why, but they know they don't want to leave, why their families came to the Netherlands and why they want to stay there. There's a unifying idea. You just have to put your finger on it and have poetry and literature about these things. And I think ultimately, as much as an audience of all military leadership may feel that, well, this really isn't our duty. I think in many ways, I can tell you that if, the Iraqis I've talked to, they're heartbroken to see us leave. The narrative is that for as different than what the media portrayed in Iraqi and Arab and OIC media, as I call it, they loved having American troops there to help protect them and lift them up into the future. It's unfortunate that we didn't have the same narrative as we had in Germany and in so many other places where we had troops we still have troops for many generations post-conflict. And I think I want to leave you last with, is there hope? Can there be hope? I really believe there is. We have to get past the distractions of this concepts of Islamophobia. Yes, there's going to be, ultimately, as I try to tell many of my colleagues who are in the anti-jihadist movement, if we get it wrong and we think that Islam is the problem, we will create a much bigger problem. Because you've got 25% of the world population that we're talking about who are Muslim. So if the strategy is going to be to convert a quarter of the world's population, that's not going to work. It's going to implode and cause the clash of civilizations that Samuel Huntington had talked about. But within the House of Islam, long-term deterrence, I think, mandates that we begin to build relationships with real allies, not allies that happen to have a common enemy with us. I mean, I can't tell you the number of Syrians that are pulling their hair out right now, seeing America aligned with a common enemy with Iran, with ISIS in Iraq. It's the summit of absurdity. And nobody's saying that somehow we're allying with Iran today, but the bottom line is I think it is a perfect narrative to the folly of picking our allies based on common enemies. In one of the chapters in my book, I talk about how future foreign policy, I would hope, is no longer that there's only two choices, ally or enemy. And now I hear in some of the think tanks talking about frenemies, right? And why don't we grade our foreign policy? Why don't we grade countries from A to F? The Pakistans of the world that might be our friends as far as fighting radical Islam, but when you look at them fueling madrasas and other radicalisms, we give them a D- or an F+, and we say it from the pulpit of not only the White House, but the Pentagon and elsewhere, to make it clear that yes, short-term deterrence will work with you. Long-term deterrence, it doesn't work. We need to, we believe these are universal principles of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you look, the OIC did not, many of whom may have signed, some of whom may have signed the UDHR, they also signed the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. So if you want to understand the countries that are Muslim majority, look and read the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights. You will see principles in there that just are not compatible with what our sons and daughters are trying to promote globally, which is liberty. Ultimately, I think there are many Muslims out there that, with or without America, are going to march in the streets for freedom. There will be Revolution 3.0, 4.0, 5.0 in Egypt until they get it right, or until they end up stuck with theocracy the way Iran is. I think without America, you're going to have a Darwin doctrine. Without NATO and Western countries, Darwin is going to win out. I don't see freedom ultimately having a chance without our troops being involved, not on the ground, but protecting at least conceptually those who are fighting for freedom. And there are 3 Ps I hope that we can promote. One is protection of liberals, giving them platforms, and ensuring them a place at the table. Those 3 things, the rest will work itself out. Abraham Lincoln, I think, said it best in our own Civil War. He said, "The possibility that we may fail in the struggle ought not to deter us from the support of a cause that we believe to be just." And I have to tell you, there's a soft bigotry of low expectations that exists when we think that the Arab world, the Muslim world, somehow is destined to be run by dictators, because that's really all they can muster. And you know, in my service, I never met another American who felt that way about anywhere where we went, whether it was Somalia or anywhere else. But unfortunately, that's what it appears when it looks like our policy thinks that somehow, well, let's just work with the dictators we got, because otherwise the whole place will implode. And that tells the moderates and the liberals who are the future. I mean, how many revolutions did the French go through and the West go through until we had our American Revolution? And even then, we needed a civil war to get many of the principles sort of right in another generation or many generations, until we're still navigating what freedom is. So ultimately, I think there's a long-term struggle, long-term deterrence, and I think the most obvious argument for what I'm telling you is that this cannot be won militarily. So unless we want to continue to do this in a whack-a-mole plan, the Muslim world, I think, also wants to see freedom, but we need to protect those that want to see it. Thank you, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Dr. Jasser, thank you very much. Dr. Jasser, thank you very much for coming.
Yes.
Question. You mentioned that the struggle for Islam is an internal Muslim issue that the Muslims have to decide. It seems to me, and I may be wrong, but a lot of the poison that the Islamists get comes straight from the Quran. How do we help solve that?
Well, that's a great question. And, you know, sort of if you ask me what's the long-term trajectory of a stabilizing influence, we know democracies have never fought wars, liberal democracies, against one another. So how do we get to that stage? I would tell you that many of these groups battling one another read the same Quran, and yet they kill one another, saying that the others are apostates, the others are, and those are, it's called takfirism, which is the belief, the declaration that someone else is not a Muslim, or they're kafar and have rejected their faith. And there's even subtle takfirism that happens against my work, saying that I'm somehow not part of the Muslim ummah or the Muslim community. And that all leads into this sense of Islamo-patriotism, if you will. But, you know, the last chapter, and the reason I put it as the last chapter in my book is, you know, it's called The Misinterpretation of Various Passages of the Quran. I will tell you that I don't think that's going to be resolved in one generation. I think it's going to take many generations. I do believe I consider myself actually to be pretty orthodox, because I not only follow the rules that I feel are my faith strictly, but in Ramadan that we just finished, not only did I fast, but I read my scripture nightly, and I believe there are moderate ways to interpret those passages which are used by the Al-Qaedas and the ISISes of the world to say that the Quran mandates these things. I mean, just to give you one example of how it can be moderated, a passage that says, do not take Jews and Christians as friends, in Arabic it says awliya. Awliya in Arabic actually means sponsors, legal sponsors, for a legal witness, if you will. So that is different than friends, and yet the Saudi interpretation has been friends in order to proclaim that they want to create sort of an Islamic cleansing and not allow there to be any mixing in a pluralist society. So a lot of the interpretations of the Quran need to be revisited as long as we maintain, I believe, as a Muslim, the authenticity of that scripture. So that debate needs to be had. But I think that's going to take generations. The short term, what can happen in the next 25 years, the next generation, is a separation of mosque and state. I think if you look, Christian Reformation happened internally with the Martin Luther's work and others, but outside of that, the canonic tradition and others were taken out of government, and I think the displacement of the theocrats and Sharia from government so that law can be decided by reason, I think is something that can happen, and many Muslims in societies like Egypt and others want to see that displaced and marginalized. And I think some of the polling has demonstrated that, and we need to do more research about that.
Dr. Chris Lepore, Global Strike. Question for you, in your opinion, do any of the Muslim majority countries currently espouse the three pillars that you speak of for a nation state? And if not, what country is the closest?
No. I wish I could say yes, and the bottom line is the way I see those three pillars, it's, these are Western nation states, characteristics, NATO, etc. The closest would probably be Indonesia. We do have an organization that's part of our coalition called Lib for All, which the former president of Indonesia helped start. So there are a lot of substrates, I think, within Indonesia that have a potential to be the substrate of a liberal society. But ultimately, the power of the Islamist movements there, the problem of endemic corruption is such that it prevents a society that has a infrastructure like we see in the West based in liberalism. And I would tell you the reason for that, Malaysia is close, but if you look at some of its laws, that it applies to Muslims, it's very Islamist in its enforcement of those. The reason is that the OIC's influence into Muslim countries is just phenomenal. The amount of money the Islamist movements that are getting from Saudi and Qatar and other countries that we call our allies and yet are fueling Islamist movements in Indonesia. Bosnia was far more moderate when we saved them in the 90s than it is today. That there are Islamist movements fueled by the Saudis that are radicalizing a lot of the communities within those countries. So, our being missing in action, the liberty ideological movement and debate, if you will, has, I think, prevented a lot of these countries from shifting. And the Arab awakening has been an opportunity, but we've squandered that opportunity as a result of not helping those groups on the ground that would have built those societies that would be similar to the West, but they still don't exist that I know of, unless I'm missing something in my assessment of them.
Question?
Yes.
Hi. I'm a fellow physician, and I must say I very much admire the position you're advocating. Having said that, the challenges are certainly huge. In a lecture I give on the mind of the terrorist, I have a picture of an 8-month-old infant with a toy suicide bomb belt on. That child didn't put that belt on, his parents did. And the issue of how to affect culture change, which is what you're talking about, really, is one that will take many generations. And the need to support nascent groups who are fighting for that liberal society is absolutely requisite. However, the power of the forces of radical Islam against those who are in that position is pretty damn strong. And
that I think you hit the nail on the head, and I would tell you that sort of what brings that together is I've always told Muslims that the instruments for the countering of these ideas could never be stronger than what they are in America. And yet the stimulus for the use of those instruments of reform and change and culture is over in the Middle East and in Muslim majority countries. And the reason is, you know, when Egyptians saw what happens when the Brotherhood takes over government, all of a sudden they have a fire under their feet to effectuate change. The Palestinian community, I've met hundreds of Palestinians who are sick and tired of Hamas running their societies, and yet they've been unable to have an Arab awakening within their community against Hamas to preserve the lives of their fellow Palestinians that are being sacrificed by a movement that is culturally promoting suicide and sacrifice. And the problem is they're not getting the ideas from fellow Muslims infused into those societies. And this is the issue, is how do we as a country begin to put enough stimulus within Muslim communities to challenge them, to get them to wake up and get past the denial. And, you know, I've said this on national TV many times, we need an intervention as a community. We're in denial. Muslims in the West are in denial. Muslims in Muslim majority countries are living under oppressive dictatorships where the ones that actually are doing what you said have paid for it with their lives being massacred in Syria. Make no mistake, the Muslims who died in what I believe is a genocide in Syria were the most moderate that existed in that country. And the reason they were being slaughtered was because they were a threat to both the dictators and the Islamists. And that's what's going to happen country after country. Now, in Egypt, we saw it went back to the dictatorship, and ultimately, somehow we have to navigate them towards societies that can, I think, utilize. I mean, after the Cold War, we had so many institutions in Washington and New York and LA and all over the country that were focused on promoting free markets and promoting ideas against socialism abroad, and they still now are some of the fabric of America that still, I think we see ourselves in Cold War 2.0 with Russia, and it hasn't ended. So why can't we do the same within the Muslim consciousness as a country and say we need a consensus that in order to effect cultural change, we have to demand that Muslims wake up to begin this reformative process? Yes.
Dr. Jasser, thank you very much. John Gower from the Ministry of Defence in UK. Very, very thought-provoking talk, and I would immediately struck by the need to get you back to the UK and not talk to Oxford, but to come and talk in Whitehall.
We won the debate, by the way.
And in fact, the Staff College. But I'm challenged by that largely because the representatives of the region on the Staff College are formed from Saudi, Bahrain, Qatar, and our allies. And it strikes me that what you are seeking is a fundamental shift in Western approach to that region, despite the history of why we are where we are. And without that fundamental shift, this is a fairly doomed call. Would you say that is an accurate assessment, that what you are calling for is for us to do a radical self-interest shift based on a long-term view rather than the short-term view?
Absolutely. And this is the issue, is that what is our interest in the region and globally? And I think you could make an economic argument that, and Jim Woolsey and others have said this much better than I, that ultimately not only alternative energy would be a mechanism to prevent the spread of petrodollars into our enemies, but free markets depend on democracies. And without free markets, ultimately all these populations, I mean, how many products, and this is what I tell Arabs and Muslims all the time, how many real innovative products have come out of the Middle East and Saudi Arabia, out of these dictatorship-run countries? Very few. And I think the fundamental shift, and this is what our youth programs focus on, is teaching our youth that the Islamic State needs to end. That concept is archaic, has been proven to be a failure, and it may be heresy for most clerics, which I think are the problem. 90-some% of clerics come out of either Cairo through the Al-Azhar path or through the Saudi path, and ultimately they teach that the Islamic State has some mechanism of success, but that's 7th century thinking. And I think, what I tell Muslims is, I'm not abandoning the tradition of the Prophet. The question is, would the Prophet Muhammad, if he was alive in the 21st century, demand that there be an Islamic State? There was no secular successful state in 620 AD when the Prophet was alive. So this is not heresy. And I tell Muslims, and this is actually, it's interesting, the last time, and my comments here are my own, they're not reflective of the commission, but our commission has visited Saudi Arabia, and we've visited Bahrain twice. And between 2011 and then when I went back in 2013, what amazed me was all of a sudden the Saudis were just vehemently, and the Bahrainis were so anti-Muslim Brotherhood. And while the Qataris are pro-Muslim Brotherhood, and they became all of a sudden how the Muslim Brotherhood is the biggest threat and the Islamist movements are threats. And I said, well, wait a minute, your theology that you teach is consistent with what they're doing. You have to abandon the Islamic State in order for their oxygen to disappear. Otherwise, you may not like political parties that are Islamic, but as long as you have oligarchs running the Islamic State, you're okay with it? And this is the, I think, the pathology of what's going on in the Middle East, is that you've got, right now, the Saudis claim they hate the Muslim Brotherhood, but they just like Islamism as long as it's run by an oligarchy or a monarchy. But they won't abandon the Islamic ideas. Why? Because that's the best way, as Marx said, to control the masses is through an opium rather than through the liberty movement. And the only way to shift that is we need a consensus. And again, in the Cold War, we never had to outlaw the Communist Party in order to have a consensus that communism was a threat to American security. And we need a consensus that not only Islamism, but the Islamic State concept can never create true allies and humanitarian systems that promote the rights of their citizens the way we respect as humanitarians, not only as Americans, but as humanitarians. Thank you.
So Dr. Jasser, as we know in deterrence, in order to influence, you first must understand. And, certainly and during the Cold War, we understood the Russians. We spent a lot of time and energy there. Probably one of the areas we in the Western world struggle with most is with understanding exactly what you're talking about. We appreciate your insight, your passion, and the work you do in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Jasser. This concludes our events for today.